My best friend stole my baby name. So I stole her baby's inheritance. I know you mentioned Celeste, but Ryan and I just fell in love with it, Jenna said at her baby shower, her hand on her 7-month bump. You understand, right? You're not even pregnant yet. I sat there holding the gift I'd brought, a handmade quilt with constellation patterns, specifically chosen because Celeste meant heavenly. I'd shared that name with Jenna 5 years ago, the night my mom died. Mom had always said if she'd had another daughter, she would have named her Celeste. It was sacred to me. Jenna knew all of this. Besides, Jenna continued, cutting her cake, you can still use it for a middle name or something. The other shower guests shifted uncomfortably. Everyone knew Jenna and I had been inseparable since college. Everyone also knew I'd been trying to conceive for 3 years, while Jenna got pregnant within 2 months of trying. Sure, I managed to say. It's a beautiful name. What else could I say? Make a scene at her baby shower? Demand she change her mind? The damage was done. 2 months later, baby Celeste was born. Jenna plastered social media with photos. Our little star, she captioned everything, using the celestial theme I'd described to her, the constellation nursery I'd planned. The star-themed monthly photos I'd dreamed about. All of it, stolen. Then, 4 months after Jenna's daughter was born, I finally got my positive test. I didn't tell anyone except my husband, Dean, for the first trimester. Not even Jenna, who texted constantly asking why I was being distant. The second trimester ultrasound revealed we were having a girl. Dean squeezed my hand. What about Eleanor? He suggested gently. Your grandmother's name? Maybe, I said, but my mind was somewhere else entirely. 2 weeks later, I ran into Jenna's mother-in-law, Diane, at the grocery store. We'd met several times at Jenna's events. How's Jenna? I asked politely. Diane's face tightened. Fine, though I'll never understand why she refused to use my mother's name. 3 generations of tradition. Broken. She shook her head. Margaret Rose. Every firstborn daughter in our family for 100 years. But Jenna said it was outdated. I knew this story. Jenna had ranted about it for years. How Ryan's family pressured her to continue the tradition. How his grandmother had even offered to pay for college if they used the name. How Diane brought it up every holiday, every birthday, every chance she got. Jenna called it her nightmare name, because she knew Diane would never let it go. Such a beautiful name, I said carefully. Full of history. Diane's eyes actually misted. My mother was Margaret Rose. I'm Margaret Rose, though I go by Diane. Ryan's sister plans to use it someday, but she's not even married. The tradition might die with me. That evening, I told Dean about the conversation. He looked at me suspiciously. You're not thinking what I think you're thinking. Margaret Rose is a beautiful name, I said innocently. Classic. Timeless. We could call her Maggie. The thing is, I genuinely did fall in love with the name. The more I said it, the more right it felt. Margaret Rose. Maggie. It was elegant but approachable. Strong but feminine. Everything Jenna had said she hated about it, I loved. We didn't announce the name until the birth. When Margaret Rose arrived, healthy and perfect, I posted one simple photo with her name, no explanation, no tags, just the announcement. My phone exploded within an hour. Jenna called 15 times. I didn't answer. She texted, "Are you serious right now?" Then, "You know what that name means to Ryan's family." Then, "This is insane. You're not even related to them." Finally, "Please call me." I responded once. "Congratulations on your daughter Celeste. I'm sure you understand that Dean and I just fell in love with Margaret Rose. You're right though. Names can't be claimed. Thanks for teaching me that." The real chaos started when Diane found out. Ryan's mother sent us a gorgeous antique silver rattle that had belonged to the original Margaret Rose. She posted about her honorary granddaughter carrying on the family tradition. She sent heirloom clothes, family photos, a hand-embroidered christening gown that had been worn by every Margaret Rose for a century. Jenna was livid. She texted, "She brings up your daughter at every family dinner. But here's the thing. Maggie really did become part of Ryan's extended family. In a weird way, Diane invites us to holiday dinners, where Maggie is treated like royalty, while Jenna seethes. And what shocked us was when the family matriarch sent Maggie a trust fund announcement on her first birthday, something she'd promised for the next Margaret Rose. 3 days after posting about the trust fund, my phone rang with Diane's number. She didn't even say hello before launching into how Maggie absolutely needed to come to Sunday dinner to meet her cousins and see all the family photos of the Margaret Roses through the years. I said yes because some part of me wanted to see this whole thing through to wherever it was going. Dean looked up from his laptop when I hung up and gave me this look that said he wasn't sure this was a good idea, but he didn't say anything out loud. Sunday came fast, and we drove to Diane's house with Maggie in her car seat, my stomach doing weird flips the whole way there. The house was packed with Ryan's extended family when we arrived. Aunts and uncles and cousins I'd only met once or twice at Jenna's wedding years ago. Everyone wanted to hold Maggie and take pictures with her and talk about how she was carrying on such an important tradition. Diane had set up this whole display of framed photos showing every Margaret Rose going back to the original one from the 1920s, and she kept pointing out features Maggie supposedly shared with each of them. Ryan's mom walked me through the whole family tree like I was already part of it, and honestly it felt good to be welcomed so completely. even though I knew why it was happening. Then I saw Jenna sitting in the corner of the living room holding Celeste, not talking to anyone, just staring at her phone. She looked up once when someone laughed really loud at something Diane said about Maggie, and the expression on her face made my chest hurt in a way I hadn't expected. Ryan's sister came over to where I was standing near the photo display and made this comment about how it's nice when family traditions actually mean something to some people, and the whole room went quiet for a second. I wanted to disappear into the floor because even though I'd wanted Jenna to feel bad, watching it happen in real time was different from I'd imagined. Diane jumped in quickly to change the subject, asking if anyone wanted more food, and the conversation started back up, but it felt forced now. About an hour later, Jenna stood up suddenly and said something about Celeste being fussy and needing to go home. Ryan looked confused because Celeste had been sleeping fine, but he got up and started gathering their stuff without arguing. I followed them out to help carry things to the car, telling myself I was just being polite, but really I wanted to see if Jenna would say anything to me. She didn't look at me once while Ryan loaded the diaper bag and car seat. Then I saw her face as she climbed into the passenger seat and realized she was crying, trying to hide it but not doing a great job. Ryan closed her door and nodded at me before getting in the driver's side, and they pulled away while I stood there in the driveway holding a casserole dish someone had handed me. For the first time since I'd announced Maggie's name, I felt something other than satisfaction, this weird twist in my stomach that might actually be guilt. I went back inside and finished the dinner, smiling and accepting compliments about Maggie, but that image of Jenna crying kept popping into my head. Dean brought it up on the drive home, asking if I was really okay with how everything had played out. I snapped at him that Jenna deserved this after what she did to me, after she took the name I'd shared with her the night my mom died. He just nodded and went quiet, didn't push me or argue, which somehow made me feel worse than if he'd gotten mad. The next week, my phone completely exploded with messages from our mutual friends. Half of them thought I was a genius for the Margaret Rose move, sending laughing emojis and saying Jenna had it coming. The other half thought I'd gone way too far, that revenge was one thing, but involving Ryan's whole family and a trust fund was crossing a line. Everyone wanted details about how much money was in the trust, and whether Diane knew I'd done this on purpose. I realized pretty quickly that our private revenge situation had turned into public entertainment for our entire friend group, with people taking sides and gossiping about it like we were characters in a show. It made me feel sick in a way I couldn't quite explain to Dean when he asked why I kept staring at my phone with that look on my face. Then Jenna's sister messaged me asking if we could talk, saying Jenna was really struggling, and their family was getting worried about possible postpartum depression. I stared at that message for like 20 minutes before responding that I'd meet her for coffee. I told myself I wasn't a complete monster, that I could at least hear her out, even though I was still angry about everything Jenna had done. We met at a coffee shop halfway between our houses, and Jenna's sister didn't waste any time getting to the point. She explained that Jenna was crying all the time, wouldn't go to any family events with Ryan anymore, and kept apologizing to him about the whole name thing, even though it was too late to change it. She asked if there was any way to fix this situation, and I honestly didn't know what to tell her. I sat there stirring my coffee and trying to figure out what fixing it would even look like at this point, because Maggie's name was Maggie's name, and the trust fund was already set up. Jenna's sister left after about 30 minutes, looking disappointed that I didn't have any answers for her, and I drove home feeling more confused than ever about whether I'd actually won anything. The hollow feeling in my chest got worse over the next few days until I finally told Dean I thought I needed to talk to someone professional about all this. He found a therapist named Adriana Moses who had good reviews and could see me pretty quickly. I went to my first appointment not really sure what I was supposed to say, but Adriana made it easy by just asking me to tell her what brought me in. I explained the whole thing from Jenna taking Celeste to me, choosing Margaret Rose to the trust fund announcement, and Adriana listened without judging or telling me I was right or wrong. At my second session, she asked me what I'd actually wanted from this whole situation, and I had to think about it for a while. I realized I'd wanted Jenna to understand how much she'd hurt me, to really get what it felt like to have something precious stolen. But sitting there in Adriana's office, I had to admit that understanding and public humiliation weren't the same thing, and maybe I'd gone further than I needed to. The satisfaction I'd expected from the revenge just wasn't showing up, and instead I kept replaying that moment of Jenna crying in the driveway, wondering if I'd become the villain in someone else's story instead of the hero in mine. Then Diane called again to invite us to Thanksgiving, making it really clear that this was a Margaret Rose family tradition, and Maggie needed to be there. Dean asked if I wanted to decline to avoid more drama with Jenna, but I couldn't bring myself to say no. Diane's affection for Maggie was genuine and real, not fake or manipulative, and rejecting that felt wrong, even though I knew it would hurt Jenna to see us there. I told Dean we'd go to Thanksgiving and just deal with whatever happened, even though my stomach twisted just thinking about it. Thanksgiving at Diane's house turned out exactly as uncomfortable as I expected. Dean and I arrived right on time with Maggie dressed in a little turkey outfit that Diane had specifically requested we bring her in. The house smelled like roasting turkey and pie, and Diane practically snatched Maggie from my arms the second we walked through the door, cooing about her precious Margaret Rose and how she needed to show her off to everyone. Ryan's extended family filled the living room and dining room, aunts and uncles and cousins I'd met at previous gatherings, and they all made a fuss over Maggie like she was the guest of honor. Diane had even set up a special high chair decorated with a banner that said, "Our little Margaret Rose," in fancy letters. I caught Dean giving me a look that said this was way more intense than either of us anticipated, but we went along with it because Diane's excitement felt genuine even if the situation was weird. An hour passed with no sign of Jenna and Ryan, and I watched Diane check her phone repeatedly and glance at the door. When they finally showed up at almost 2 o'clock, a full hour late, Jenna looked exhausted, and Ryan seemed tense. Celeste was fussy in Ryan's arms, and Jenna barely made eye contact with anyone as they came in. Diane immediately asked what took so long, her voice tight with that particular tone mothers use when they're annoyed but trying not to show it in front of guests. Ryan mumbled something about Celeste's nap schedule being off and needing to wait for her to wake up, but I saw Jenna's jaw clench like that wasn't the real reason at all. They sat at the far end of the table from us, and the meal was so awkward I could barely eat my turkey. Jenna pushed food around her plate, and Ryan kept his eyes down, and every time Diane mentioned Maggie or the Margaret Rose tradition, I watched Jenna's shoulders get tighter. Halfway through dinner, Celeste started crying and wouldn't stop, and Jenna stood up abruptly and said they needed to go. Ryan tried to convince her to stay for dessert at least, but she was already gathering their things and heading for the door. I followed them out to the driveway under the excuse of getting something from our car, and that's when I overheard Diane catching Ryan at his vehicle. She asked him straight out why they never stayed for full family dinners anymore, why they always had an excuse to leave early, and her voice cracked a little like she already knew the answer, but needed to hear him say it. Ryan looked miserable standing there with Celeste's car seat in one hand, and he said something about Celeste's schedule being unpredictable, and Jenna being tired from night feedings. But everyone knew those were just excuses. The real reason stood in Diane's living room wearing a turkey outfit and being treated like the family princess, while Jenna's daughter got barely a glance. I got back in the car and Dean asked if I was okay, and I told him I didn't know anymore. 2 days after Thanksgiving, my phone rang from a number I didn't recognize with a local area code. I almost didn't answer because I was in the middle of changing Maggie's diaper, but something made me pick up. The voice on the other end was older, warm but with a slight shake that comes with age, and she introduced herself as Aurelia, Ryan's grandmother. She said Diane had given her my number and she hoped I didn't mind the call, but she was 87 years old and wanted to meet the baby carrying her name before she ran out of time. The way she said it so matter of fact, like she was talking about running out of milk instead of running out of life, caught me completely off guard. She asked if she could visit sometime soon, maybe this week if that worked, and her voice had this quality that made it impossible to say no. I found myself agreeing to Thursday afternoon, giving her our address, and when I hung up I realized my hands were shaking. Dean asked who called and I told him about Aurelia wanting to visit, and he got this concerned look and asked if I was ready for that. I wasn't sure what being ready would even look like, but I said yes anyway because turning down an 87-year-old woman who wanted to meet her namesake felt wrong regardless of how we got here. Thursday came faster than I expected, and I spent the morning cleaning the house like Aurelia was going to inspect it with white gloves. Dean took off work early to be there, and when the doorbell rang at exactly 2 o'clock, my stomach did this flip thing that made me feel like I was meeting royalty. Aurelia was tiny, maybe 5 feet tall, with white hair pulled back in a neat bun, and these sharp blue eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. She moved slowly with a cane but refused Dean's offer to help her to the couch, saying she wasn't dead yet and could manage just fine. The second she sat down and I brought Maggie over, her whole face transformed. She held out her arms and I placed Maggie in them, and Aurelia started crying these quiet tears that rolled down her cheeks while she stared at my daughter. She touched Maggie's face so gently, tracing her features, and whispered that she looked just like the original Margaret Rose had looked as a baby. Then she started talking, and for the next 2 hours I sat there listening to stories I never expected to hear. She told me about her mother, the first Margaret Rose, who was born in 1920 and lived through the Depression, how her mother used to tell her that the name meant strong like a rose but steady like Margaret of Antioch, and how that strength got their family through years when they had nothing. She talked about being named Margaret Rose herself, going by her middle name Aurelia to avoid confusion, and how she'd passed the name to her daughter Diane, who also went by her middle name. She described what it meant to carry a name through wars and depressions and joy, how each Margaret Rose added to the legacy while keeping it alive. She held Maggie the entire time, rocking her gently, and told stories about family weddings and funerals and ordinary Tuesdays that somehow mattered because they were lived by women who carried this name. When she finally handed Maggie back to me, she squeezed my hand and thanked me for giving the name a home, for making sure it didn't die with her generation. I felt the weight of what this name represented pressing down on me, and it had nothing to do with Jenna or revenge or anything I'd been thinking about when I chose it. After Aurelia left, I lasted maybe 10 minutes before I started crying. Not pretty crying either, but the ugly kind where you can't catch your breath and your nose runs and you can't stop even when you want to. Dean found me on the bathroom floor and just sat down next to me, pulling me against his chest while I sobbed into his shirt. I told him I chose this name to hurt Jenna, not to honor a century of family history, not to carry on something that meant everything to people I didn't even know. He rubbed my back and let me cry it out, and when I finally calmed down enough to breathe normally, he said the name could mean both things. That I could have chosen it for the wrong reasons, and it could still turn into something right. That intentions and outcomes don't always match up. I asked him how I was supposed to live with that, with knowing I'd use something sacred as a weapon, and he said the same way everyone lives with their mistakes by trying to do better going forward. I wasn't sure I believed him, wasn't sure I could separate the revenge from the legacy, but I let him hold me anyway because I didn't know what else to do. The trust fund lawyer called a week later, introducing himself as Fabian Painter and saying he needed to meet with us to handle some paperwork. We set up an appointment at his office for the following Tuesday, and Dean and I drove there with Maggie in the back seat, both of us quiet and tense. Fabian's office was in one of those old buildings downtown with wood paneling and leather chairs that smelled like old books. He was maybe 60, with gray hair and reading glasses, and he laid out a stack of documents on his desk that looked intimidating. He explained that Aurelia had set up the trust fund almost 20 years ago, back when Diane was pregnant with Ryan, specifically for whoever carried on the Margaret Rose name. The fund had been growing all this time, invested carefully, and was now worth just over $200,000. Fabian went through the terms carefully, explaining that Maggie would have access to the money for college expenses, starting a business, or buying a home, with specific distributions at ages 18, 25, and 30. He said Aurelia had been very specific about wanting the money to help the next Margaret Rose build a good life, to give her opportunities that previous generations hadn't had. As he talked, I felt the situation getting more and more complicated, felt the weight of this gift that came from my worst impulses. Dean squeezed my hand under the table, and I squeezed back, and we signed all the papers that made Maggie's future more secure while making my guilt heavier. 3 months passed with no contact from Jenna, and I'd started to think maybe that was just how things would be now. Former best friends who avoided each other in our small town. Then my phone buzzed with a text from her number. Just 3 words. Can we talk? No question mark, no explanation, just those 3 words that made my heart start racing. I stared at my phone for 20 minutes, reading and rereading the message. My thumb hovering over the keyboard. Dean asked what was wrong, and I showed him the text, and he said I should do whatever felt right, but that he'd support me either way. I finally typed back that I was willing to meet, and my hands shook so badly I had to retype it twice to fix the typos. She responded immediately with a suggestion to meet at Riverside Park, halfway between our houses, the next day at 10. I agreed and spent the rest of the night unable to sleep, playing out 100 different versions of what she might say, and what I might say back. The park was almost empty when I got there. Just a few joggers and one older man walking his dog. I pushed Maggie's stroller along the path until I saw Jenna coming from the other direction with Celeste's stroller, and we both stopped about 10 feet apart like we needed that buffer zone. For 5 full minutes, neither of us said anything, just stood there pushing our strollers back and forth slightly, the way you do to keep babies calm. I studied the ground, the trees, anything but Jenna's face, and I could tell she was doing the same thing. Finally, she took a breath and said she was sorry, really sorry, and the words came out rushed like she'd been practicing them. She said she didn't understand what the name meant to me until she watched me take something that meant everything to Ryan's family, until she saw how it felt to have something precious stolen. Her voice cracked on the last word, and I finally looked up at her, saw that she'd been crying before she even got here. I wanted to stay angry, wanted to hold on to the righteous fury that had fueled me for months, but standing there looking at her swollen eyes and slumped shoulders, I couldn't find it anymore. I told Jenna I was sorry too, and the words felt strange coming out, but true at the same time. I said I wanted to hurt her the way she hurt me, that I'd succeeded, but it didn't feel the way I thought it would. She started crying harder, and I started crying too, and we stood there in this park with our sleeping babies between us, both of us crying over the mess we'd made of everything Celeste stirred in her stroller, and Maggie made a little sound, but neither of them woke up, tiny and oblivious to their mothers falling apart 10 feet away from each other. I grabbed tissues from my diaper bag and handed one to Jenna, and we both laughed a little at how ridiculous we must look, 2 grown women sobbing in a park on a Tuesday morning. After we both calmed down, Jenna started talking again, and this time her voice was steadier. She admitted she took the name Celeste because she was jealous of my relationship with my mom, jealous of how I had these deep, meaningful stories and connections, while her own mom was distant and critical. She said she wanted something that felt that meaningful, that carried that kind of weight, and she didn't think about whether I'd actually have a daughter, or whether it would matter years later. She called it thoughtless and selfish, and said it didn't excuse what she did, but at least explained it. I listened and felt something shift in my chest. Not forgiveness exactly, but understanding maybe. The kind that comes from seeing someone's ugly truth and recognizing it's not that different from your own. I told her I got it, that I'd done the same thing in reverse, taken something meaningful to hurt her without thinking about all the other people it would affect. We were both quiet for a minute, watching our daughters sleep, and I thought about how we'd both weaponized names that should have been about love and legacy. We ended up talking for almost 2 hours, really talking the way we used to before everything got broken. We agreed our friendship probably couldn't go back to what it was, that there was too much damage and too much hurt on both sides. But we also agreed that maybe we could find a way to be civil, maybe even friendly eventually, especially since our daughters would grow up in the same community and probably end up in the same schools. Jenna said she didn't want Celeste and Maggie to inherit our drama, to grow up with this weird tension neither of them caused. I agreed and said we owed it to them to at least try to be adults about this, even if being best friends again wasn't possible. When we finally said goodbye, Jenna reached out and squeezed my arm, and I squeezed back, and it felt like an ending and a beginning at the same time. That evening at home, Dean looked up from feeding Maggie when I walked through the door, and I could see the question in his face before he even asked how it went. I sat down at the kitchen table and told him everything, the crying and the apologies and the agreement to try being civil for our daughters. He put down the baby spoon and reached across to squeeze my hand, his shoulders dropping like he'd been holding tension for months. He said he hated watching me carry all that anger around, that it changed me in ways I probably didn't even notice. He thought Maggie deserved to grow up without inheriting our drama, without absorbing the bitterness between her parents and Jenna's family. I nodded because he was right, even though part of me still wanted to hold on to the satisfaction of my revenge. 2 weeks later, Diane called asking if we'd come to Christmas dinner, and mentioned she'd invited Jenna and Ryan too. I texted Jenna before responding, asking if she felt okay about both families being there. She took an hour to reply but finally said yes, that we had to start somewhere, and a big family gathering might be easier than something intimate. I called Diane back and accepted, my stomach twisting at the thought of navigating a holiday meal with everyone watching to see if Jenna and I would explode at each other. Christmas Day arrived cold and bright, and Dean drove us to Diane's house with Maggie bundled in her car seat, making happy baby sounds. Jenna and Ryan were already there when we walked in, Celeste asleep in Ryan's arms. The first few minutes felt stiff and awkward, everyone being extra polite and careful with their words. But then Diane started fussing over both babies equally, cooing at Celeste and then turning to do the same with Maggie, passing out matching handmade Christmas outfits she'd sewn for both girls. I watched her move between the two carriers, giving equal attention and love, and something loosened in my chest. She had enough love for everyone, had never seen this as a competition even when Jenna and I turned it into one. After dinner, Ryan found me in the hallway near the bathroom and asked if we could talk for a minute. We stepped into Diane's home office and he closed the door, then turned to me with tired eyes. He thanked me for talking to Jenna at the park, said she'd been doing so much better since that conversation, more like herself again. He admitted the whole name situation had put huge strain on their marriage because his family kept bringing it up at every gathering, making Jenna feel like an outsider at her own in-law events. His voice cracked a little when he said he'd been scared they might not make it through, that the resentment was eating away at everything good between them. I told Ryan I was sorry for using his family tradition as a weapon, that I'd been so focused on hurting Jenna I hadn't thought about how it would affect him or their marriage. He surprised me by saying he got it, that his sister had done something similar to a cousin years ago over a different family conflict. He said family dynamics were complicated, especially around names and legacy and all the weight people put on those things. We stood there in that small office for another minute, not saying anything else, but something felt settled between us that hadn't been before. My next therapy session with Adriana happened on a rainy Tuesday morning. I told her about the park conversation with Jenna and the Christmas dinner, and how I felt guilty but also still angry sometimes. She leaned forward in her chair and said both things could be true at the same time, that I didn't have to choose between them. Jenna had hurt me badly by taking something sacred, and I'd hurt her back by weaponizing a family tradition, and now we both had to figure out how to move forward carrying those scars. She said healing wasn't about forgetting or pretending the hurt never happened. It was about learning to live with the complicated truth of what we'd done to each other. Maggie's 6-month checkup came the following week, and the pediatrician measured and weighed her, declaring everything perfect. While updating the chart, the doctor commented on her name, asking if Margaret Rose was a family name. I hesitated for just a second before saying yes, because it was now even if it started as revenge. The name had grown bigger than my original intentions, had taken on a life and meaning beyond the spite that first made me choose it. The doctor smiled and said it was lovely. Classic names like that were making a comeback. That night, after putting Maggie down, I pulled out a new journal I'd bought and started writing. I addressed it to Maggie, explaining the complicated story of her name in simple words she'd understand someday when she was old enough. I wrote about my mom and the name Celeste, about Jenna taking it and how much that hurt. I wrote about meeting Diane at the grocery store and learning about the Margaret Rose tradition, about choosing the name partly for revenge and partly because I genuinely loved it. I wanted her to know both the beautiful family history she'd inherited and the messy truth of how she became part of it. Wanted her to understand that people and their choices were rarely simple or pure. 3 weeks later, Jenna texted asking if I wanted to grab coffee, just the two of us without the crying this time. We met at a place halfway between our houses, both of us pushing strollers with our daughters bundled against the February cold. We talked about mom stuff, sleep schedules, and teething and the weird rashes babies get for no reason. We carefully avoided the name drama, skirting around it like a hole in the conversation neither of us wanted to fall into. It wasn't friendship yet, not the way it used to be, but it wasn't enemies either. It felt like progress, like we were building something new from the broken pieces of what we'd had before. The next month, Aurelia called and invited me to lunch, just the two of us without Dean or Maggie. We met at a quiet restaurant near her assisted living facility, and she spent 2 hours telling me stories about the 4 Margaret Roses who came before my daughter. She described her mother's strength during the Depression, her own childhood during the war, the family traditions that had been passed down through generations. After we finished eating, she pulled out a cardboard box filled with family photos and heirlooms, things she'd been saving for the next Margaret Rose. She pushed it across the table and said Maggie should know where she came from, even if the path here was unconventional. Her eyes were bright and clear when she said sometimes the universe worked in mysterious ways. That night, I showed Dean everything from the box, spreading the photos across our bed while Maggie slept in her crib. We looked at pictures of women who carried this name through a century of history, through wars and peace and ordinary life. There were letters and baby clothes and a silver brush set that had belonged to the first Margaret Rose. Dean picked up a photo of Aurelia as a young woman holding her own daughter, and his eyes got wet. He said maybe the universe really did work in mysterious ways, bringing Maggie into this legacy even through my revenge, turning something born from hurt into something beautiful and lasting. The next week, our friend Sarah texted inviting us to her daughter's second birthday party. She mentioned that Jenna and Ryan were coming too, the first time anyone had tried putting us in the same room since everything happened. Dean asked if I wanted to skip it, but I said we should go because avoiding each other forever wasn't realistic when we lived in the same town and had the same friends. The party was at a park with a bounce house and face painting, and when we arrived, Jenna was already there pushing Celeste on the baby swings. We made eye contact across the playground, and both did this awkward half-wave thing before focusing hard on our daughters. I spent most of the party talking to other moms about sleep training and teething, making sure to stay on the opposite side of the playground from Jenna. When the cake came out, we ended up standing near each other in the crowd, and I could feel the other parents watching us like we might start fighting, but we just sang happy birthday with everyone else, fed our babies tiny pieces of cake, and wiped frosting off their faces. On the drive home, Dean said that went better than expected, and I agreed, even though my shoulders had been tense the entire time. 2 days later, Diane called asking if I'd bring Maggie to her weekly grandmother's group on Thursday mornings. She explained that she met with 5 other grandmas at a coffee shop, and they all brought photos of their grandkids, and she really wanted to show Maggie off in person. I hesitated because it felt weird, but Diane sounded so excited that I agreed to come once and see how it went. Thursday morning, I dressed Maggie in one of the heirloom outfits Diane had sent, a little white dress with pink flowers that had belonged to the first Margaret Rose. At the coffee shop, Diane introduced me to her friends, and they all cooed over Maggie, passing her around and taking turns holding her. One woman asked how I was related to Diane, and Diane jumped in saying I was her honorary daughter-in-law, which made me feel both touched and guilty. The women asked about Maggie's name, and Diane told the whole story about the family tradition, beaming with pride the entire time. Watching her show off photos on her phone and brag about Maggie to her friends, I felt grateful that something good came from my messy revenge, even if the motivation had been terrible at the start. The following week, Jenna texted me directly for the first time in months. She asked if maybe our daughters could have a playdate sometime. Just the 4 of us without Dean or Ryan or any extended family around. I stared at my phone for a full minute, surprised she was reaching out. Part of me wanted to say no because things were still complicated and awkward, but another part was curious if we could build something new from the broken pieces of our friendship. I texted back that I was willing to try to. We made plans for the next Saturday at a neutral park halfway between our houses. Saturday morning, I was nervous driving to the park, not sure what to expect or how to act. Jenna was already there when I arrived, sitting on a bench with Celeste in a stroller. We said hi and spread out a blanket in the grass, then put both babies down with some toys between them. For the first 10 minutes, we mostly just watched the girls, making small comments about how Celeste was trying to grab everything and how Maggie kept rolling onto her stomach. Then we started talking about real stuff like how neither of us was sleeping more than 3 hours at a time, and how pediatricians always made us feel like we were doing everything wrong. Jenna laughed when I described Maggie's blowout at the grocery store last week, and I laughed when she told me about Celeste screaming through an entire Target trip. We carefully avoided talking about the name drama or Ryan's family or anything heavy, just stuck to the daily struggles of keeping tiny humans alive. When it was time to leave, Jenna stood up and hugged me, and for a second it almost felt normal, like maybe we could find our way back to something resembling friendship, even if it would never be exactly what we had before. 3 weeks later, Ryan's whole extended family gathered for Aurelia's 88th birthday at a big community center they'd rented. Dean and I weren't sure if we should go since it was a family event, but Diane insisted and said Aurelia specifically wanted Maggie there. When we arrived, the place was packed with at least 50 people, multiple generations of Ryan's family all celebrating together. Aurelia sat in a big chair in the middle of everything, wearing a purple dress and a birthday crown, looking tiny but fierce. After lunch, someone announced they were doing a special family photo with all the Margaret Roses, and Aurelia waved me over. A professional photographer had set up lights and a backdrop, and I stood there holding Maggie while Diane and 2 other women I'd never met lined up beside us. The photographer arranged us by age with Aurelia in the center, and I felt completely overwhelmed realizing I was now part of this century-old tradition. Through the messiest possible path, Aurelia held Maggie for one of the photos, and watching her cradle my daughter with such obvious joy made my throat tight. After the photos, Ryan's sister found me by the dessert table. She introduced herself as Nicole and said she wanted to apologize for some of the pointed comments she'd made at that first dinner when Maggie was a newborn. She explained that she'd always planned to use Margaret Rose for her own future daughter someday, had been planning it since she was a teenager, but seeing how happy Aurelia was about Maggie, how the name had found its way to a baby who would actually be raised knowing and loving this family history, made her realize the name had found the right home. She said she'd pick something else when she eventually had kids, and she seemed genuinely at peace with it. I thanked her for telling me and apologized for the awkward situation, and she just shrugged and said, families were complicated. Later that night, after putting Maggie to bed, I sat with Dean on the couch thinking about everything. I told him how weird it was that so many people had claims or plans for this name, from Diane wanting to continue the tradition, to Nicole planning to use it to Jenna being pressured about it for years. Somehow Maggie ended up with it through the absolute messiest path possible, born from my hurt and anger, but landing her in this whole legacy she'd carry forward. Dean laughed and said she'd have one hell of a story to tell someday, when she was old enough to understand it all, and he wasn't wrong about that. The next Tuesday, I had my regular session with Adriana. We'd been working on processing everything that happened, and that day we talked specifically about forgiveness. She asked if I'd forgiven Jenna for taking the name Celeste, and I said I was working on it, but it still hurt when I thought about it too much. Then she asked if I'd forgiven myself for the revenge, for deliberately choosing a name I knew would cause problems. That question hit harder because I hadn't really thought about forgiving myself, had been so focused on whether what I did was justified. Adriana pointed out that I could acknowledge I acted from a place of deep hurt, while also taking responsibility for the pain I caused Jenna and the chaos I created in Ryan's family. She said both things were true at the same time, that I was both the person who got wronged and the person who wronged someone else back, and learning to hold both truths was part of growing up and becoming better. 2 weeks after that therapy session, my phone rang while I was making dinner. It was Jenna, and when I answered, she was crying but in a happy way. She said Celeste had just said her first word, which was mama, and she'd immediately wanted to call and share it with someone who would really understand how big that moment felt. We talked for 20 minutes about first words and milestones and how fast they were growing, and the whole conversation felt easy and genuine in a way nothing had felt between us in over a year. The fact that she'd called me, that I was the person she wanted to share that moment with, felt like a real turning point. Not back to what we were before, but forward into something new we were building together. That same week, Dean came home from work grinning and announced he'd gotten the promotion he'd been hoping for. We celebrated by ordering expensive takeout and opening a bottle of wine after Maggie was asleep. Then Dean pulled out his laptop and showed me something he'd been researching, a college savings plan separate from the trust fund Aurelia had set up. He said Maggie should have opportunities that came from us too, not just from the complicated legacy attached to her name. We spent an hour setting up the account and making our first deposit, and it felt good to be giving her something that had nothing to do with revenge or family drama, just her parents planning for her future. A few days later, I sat down and wrote Aurelia a long letter, thanking her for everything she'd done for Maggie. I told her how much it meant that she welcomed us so completely into the family history and shared all those stories about the Margaret Roses who came before. I explained that I wanted her to know how grateful we were, not just for the trust fund, but for making Maggie feel like she truly belonged to this legacy. Her response came in the mail 2 weeks later, written in shaky handwriting that made my throat tight. She said that Margaret Rose names have always found their way to the right babies, that somehow the universe guides these things even when people think they're making choices for the wrong reasons. She wrote that she believed Maggie was meant to carry this name forward, and that watching our family become part of their tradition brought her more joy than I could imagine. I cried reading it and put the letter in Maggie's baby book so she'd have it someday. The following Tuesday, Jenna texted asking if I wanted to try a mom and baby yoga class with her. I almost said no out of habit, but something made me agree. We met at the studio with both girls, and the class itself was fine. Nothing special, just a bunch of tired moms trying to stretch while babies crawled around the mats. Afterward, we grabbed smoothies at the place next door, and the woman working there messed up both our orders completely, giving us green drinks that tasted like lawn clippings mixed with sadness. Jenna made a face and said something about how the instructor kept calling it sacred mama time, while her own baby was literally eating yoga mat foam, and I just lost it laughing. She started laughing too, and we sat there cracking up about the whole ridiculous experience, and it felt easy and light in a way nothing had felt between us in over a year. Walking to our cars, Jenna said she'd miss this. Miss just being able to laugh with me about stupid stuff, and I realized I'd missed it too. 2 weeks before Maggie's first birthday, Diane called asking if she could throw a party for her. She wanted to invite the whole extended family and make it special since it was the first birthday for the newest Margaret Rose. I checked with Jenna first, not wanting to blindside her, and she said they'd come, that Celeste should be there too. The party was at Diane's house with decorations everywhere and more food than 20 people could eat. Ryan's cousins came with their kids, and his sister brought her boyfriend, and Aurelia sat in the best chair watching everything with this huge smile on her face. Jenna and Ryan showed up right on time with Celeste, who'd gotten so big since I'd last seen her. Watching our daughters play together on the floor, passing toys back and forth in that weird baby way where they don't really interact but exist near each other, I thought about how they'd grow up knowing each other. They'd be at the same school events probably, maybe even in the same classes someday. I was glad we'd worked through enough of our mess that they could have that our drama wouldn't define their relationship the way it had defined ours. The next week, Fabian called asking us to come to his office to finalize the trust fund paperwork. Dean took time off work, and we met with him on a Thursday morning. Fabian walked us through all the details, explaining that Maggie would have access to the funds for education expenses starting at 18, or for starting a business, or for buying her first home. The amount had grown since Aurelia first set it up, and hearing the actual number made my stomach flip. This incredible gift had come from my worst impulses, from my desire to hurt Jenna, and now it would shape Maggie's entire future. Fabian had us sign about 15 different documents, and the whole time I kept thinking about how I needed to make sure she used this wisely, that she understood the responsibility that came with it. That evening, after putting Maggie to bed, I brought Dean the journal I'd been keeping since before she was born. I told him I wanted him to read it, all of it. The parts about choosing her name for revenge, and the parts about falling in love with the family history and everything in between. He sat on the couch and read the whole thing in one sitting while I pretended to watch TV, but really just watched him. When he finished, he looked at me and said it was important that I was being this honest, not sugarcoating the revenge or pretending it was all noble from the start. He said Maggie would need to know the real story someday, complicated and messy as it was, because that's how life actually works. 2 weeks after Maggie's first birthday, Diane called early in the morning crying. Aurelia had passed away peacefully in her sleep, and the family was making arrangements. The funeral was 4 days later, and I was shocked when Ryan called asking if I would speak about carrying on the Margaret Rose tradition. He said Aurelia had specifically mentioned wanting me included in the service, that I represented the future of the family name. I wrote and rewrote my speech about 10 times, trying to find the right words. At the funeral, I stood up in front of everyone and talked about legacy and second chances, and babies who bring families together in unexpected ways. I talked about how Aurelia taught me that names carry history forward, and that sometimes the path to belonging is stranger than anyone plans. My voice shook the whole time, but I got through it, and afterward people hugged me like I was actually part of the family. A week later, the lawyer handling Aurelia's estate called us in for the will reading. She'd left specific items to different family members, and when he got to Maggie's part, he pulled out a small velvet box. Inside was a gold locket with photos of all 5 Margaret Roses, tiny perfect pictures including one of Maggie from her birthday party. The inscription on the back said, "For the girl who brought the name home," and I started crying right there in the lawyer's office. Aurelia had seen past my revenge to something bigger, had recognized that despite my messy motives, Maggie really did belong to this legacy Dean drove home because I couldn't stop crying, and we put the locket in the safe to give Maggie when she was old enough to understand what it meant. After the funeral, Jenna texted asking if I wanted to get coffee, and we met at the place halfway between our houses again. She told me that watching how Aurelia loved Maggie, how the whole family embraced her, helped her understand what family legacy really means. She said it's not about obligation or pressure like she'd always felt from Diane, but about belonging and connection and being part of something that stretches across time. Then she said something that surprised me, that she was genuinely glad the name went to someone who'd be surrounded by that history and love, that maybe it was meant to work out this way, even if we got there through hurt and anger. 6 months passed with things feeling almost normal between us. We did play dates every few weeks, texted about mom stuff, and slowly rebuilt something that felt like friendship, even though it was different from before. Then one Tuesday, Jenna called and asked if she could come over. She showed up with Celeste and this nervous energy, and finally she told me she was pregnant again. She was barely 8 weeks along, but she wanted me to know, wanted to ask my opinion on names this time instead of just deciding on her own. We spent the whole afternoon going through baby name books and websites, throwing out options and laughing at the weird ones and actually talking through what felt right. She said she wanted something meaningful but not loaded with family drama, and I helped her narrow it down to a few favorites that felt fresh and completely theirs. Leaving, she hugged me tight and said she was glad we found our way to this, to a new kind of friendship that was different from before, but real and honest. At 14 months, Maggie took her first wobbly steps across our living room. Dean and I both cheered like she'd won an Olympic medal, and she looked so proud of herself before falling on her diaper-padded bottom. Watching her try again, determined to make it to the couch, I thought about the whole journey from revenge to this moment. I couldn't say I regretted choosing her name because it brought us Diane and Aurelia and the trust fund, and eventually a path back to Jenna. Sometimes the messiest choices lead to the most unexpected blessings, and I was learning to make peace with all of it. The hurt and the healing, the revenge and the redemption, the way life rarely works out clean and simple like you plan. Maggie pulled herself up and took 3 more steps before Dean caught her, and her laugh filled the whole house with joy that had nothing to do with names or drama or anything except being loved completely for exactly who she was.